Now and for Sign On with Tessa de Pledge and Paul Redfern.
Hello and welcome to Sign On Newswatch. I'm Tessa de Pledge, and on the first Saturday of each month, along with my colleagues, I'll be looking back at the previous month's news. We'll be taking reports especially supplied to us by ITN and showing them with a sign language interpreter, giving deaf people unprecedented access to some of the best in television news.
I'm Paul Redfern. I'll be joining Tessa to explore some of the issues behind the news. Where we feel that you might welcome some additional explanation, we'll give it to you. And we'll be inviting you to tell us which news stories you'd like us to cover.
I'm Paul Johnston, Sign On's parliamentary correspondent. I'm based at Westminster, and I'll be keeping my eye on what's going on in Parliament. And again, if there's anything you'd like to know more about, just let us know, and we'll try to cover it for you.
And Paul Johnston will certainly have his work cut out this month, because in our first ever Newswatch, we're going to be looking back over the month of March at the first stages of the build-up to the general election. For weeks, people had been saying that the date to look out for was April the 9th. They said the Conservatives would use the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont's budget, on March the 10th, to offer the voters some attractive measures, and then call a quick election to take advantage. And sure enough, by lunchtime on Wednesday, March the 11th, it was clear when polling day would be, April the 9th.
Just before midday, John Major's Daimler swept him into Buckingham Palace, past crowds who had gathered to watch the changing of the guard and were oblivious to the day's political drama. The Prime Minister was on his way to tell the Queen the decision was finally made, that the moment had come to ask for the people's judgment on his government and to ask for Parliament to be dissolved. Just over an hour after this audience, he was back in Downing Street, announcing the end to the longest pre-election campaign of this century.
I can now confirm to you that this morning I saw Her Majesty the Queen and sought her permission for a dissolution of Parliament and a general election on April the 9th.
The first sign that the decision had been made came early. Chris Patten, the party chairman, hurrying from his home on the way to Central Office. And then to Cabinet, there to join fellow Cabinet members summoned to a special meeting to hear the decision, which Mr. Major supported with selected quotations from the morning papers. From behind his red door, Neil Kinnock in high spirits.
Okay, I'm bringing Fluffy with me.
He said the sooner the election came, the better he'd like it.
Really, it's high time that Mr. Major went to the Queen and said that he'd like to have the election, and the sooner the better.
And back from Yeovil to London came Paddy Ashdown.
Every nut and bolt tightened, we're ready to go whenever the Prime Minister says it's time to go.
Mr. Major finalised plans this morning over a poached egg on toast and a cup of tea. Poached eggs for breakfast, very much part of the Major style. As was the chat he had with school children outside number 10, he told them he likes living here.
I like it very much indeed. It's a very nice place to live. It's not my real home, but it's very nice to live here. I'm glad you're all ready to come. Lovely to see you there. Lovely.
Thank you for that.
I'm utterly confident we'll win. We have a programme that's right for this country. We're looking forward to the future. We can see the changes that are taking place. We're going to build on what has actually happened in the 1980s. We know what this country's place in the world is and how we can improve upon it.
Neil Kinnock watched the election announcement in his Commons room. This time he says he will do it.
I feel very good indeed, because the dithering and delay by the Prime Minister has caused damage to the country, and now we know we can get on with the election, we can get a new government, we can get Britain a fresh start with Labour.
Labour's buoyed up by signs in recent opinion polls that they're edging ahead, but the presence of their campaign coordinator out on the streets with the leaflets is a public demonstration of the size of the task. They need to win almost 100 seats for an overall majority. But there's no doubting the shadow cabinet's in good heart. It's going to be a campaign very much about the leaders, a campaign which some are predicting will be a dirty one.
The insults against me are not difficult to take. I'm a man of 50 years of age, and I've been around a bit. It didn't bother me at all.
The polls show the Liberal Democrats with less support than in the last election, but this time the two major parties are close together, which is why the Liberal Democrats believe they could end up holding the balance of power.
I think the public feel that the kind of negative, misrepresentational campaign full of insult and invective has bored the public to death. They're brassed off with it, and frankly so am I. I think it's doing our democratic process no good. I do think it's doing the two political parties and their leaders no good, and we have no intention of taking any part in it.
We just saw John Major going to see the Queen. Why did you do that?
Well, John Major as Prime Minister is head of government, but the Queen is still the head of state. The government is Her Majesty's government. So, according to the Constitution, it's the Queen who has to give permission, but she always does give permission.
So that means the Queen can actually refuse to give permission or agree to it?
She could in principle, but it's a constitutional monarchy, so the power really lies with the Prime Minister. And in fact, it's very important because it gives him an advantage over his rivals, because he can choose when the election's going to be.
So why did John Major choose April 9th? Why that Thursday?
Well, John Major was running out of time. The Prime Minister has the power to choose, but a Parliament can only last up to 5 years. So he had to decide before July, and people said he might have gone last June or November, but he hung on and was forced to go now, despite the fact that we've got a big recession. He was hoping, though, that Norman Lamont's budget would give him a good start to the campaign.
Why did he hope the budget would make a difference?
Well, everyone was talking about big tax cuts, maybe 1 penny or 2 penny off income tax. In fact, the government finances weren't good enough to allow that. But Norman Lamont did come forward with some tax cuts for people on low incomes, proportionately more for them. But in the end, that didn't seem to have created the groundswell of upswell of opinion that John Major would have liked.
On Monday, March the 16th, the Shadow Chancellor, John Smith, announced Labour's alternative budget. He said Labour's budget meant that everyone earning less than £22,000 a year would be better off. But, unlike Norman Lamont, he said that there would be no tax cuts. In fact, he raised the top rate of tax from 40 pence to 50 pence for those earning over £40,000 a year. He also said that those earning above £21,060 a year would pay more national insurance. But he promised more money for economic recovery, the National Health Service and education. Labour's alternative budget stole the limelight from the launch of the Liberal Democrats' manifesto. The party manifesto is an important part of any election campaign because it spells out what the party will do if it gets the chance to form a government.
Paddy Ashdown is out to try and prove a lot of people wrong. He has abandoned one of the first rules of campaigning, that promising to put up people's taxes is electoral death. You don't, he's telling the country, get something for nothing. So if you want to change Britain, you have got to pay for it.
So the Tories will offer a bribe, which I believe will be rejected. The Labour Party will offer a pennies from heaven approach. I'm told that you can never win elections on the basis that you tell the truth. I tell you this, I intend to prove that to be a lie.
Different ideas in a different shaped manifesto, like a weekend supplement, but bigger, designed to catch the eye in the newsagents, and with a warning inside the cover that the message may not be what you expect. Though, if you want the fine print on the costings, you have to find another £1.50 and send away for them.
Unlike Labour and the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats proposed to increase the basic rate of income tax by 1 penny in the pound. They said they would spend the extra tax receipts on education. 2 days later, on Wednesday the 18th, the two biggest parties launched their manifestos.
The day begins. A beaming Neil Kinnock poses with a glossy new manifesto and a shadow cabinet in which women members are given prominent place. The launch of these manifestos is as much about creating the right image as putting forward new policies. Press officers seem more anxious about the music starting on time than about policy. Labour provided a stirring new theme tune and a new set, lit from below in pink. It's a slick act, all designed to create the impression that they will be able to run the country, and in particular the economy, better than the Conservatives.
If they can't get it right, in 13 years, they never will. A Labour government will mean a fresh start for Britain. It will mean strong and continued emphasis on investment for economic strength.
90 minutes later, the Conservative launch. No music this time, but an imposing set, even if it looked a little like the one that used to be occupied by the Soviet Politburo. The Conservative manifesto, and indeed this set, is dominated by the face of the Prime Minister. He is seen as the party's most important asset. For the most part, his delivery is smiling and affable. Only in response to Mr. Kinnock, who said his policies were stale, does the tone suddenly harden.
What he has to say. I can tell him some of the stale policies we certainly won't have. We certainly won't have a minimum wage that's going to put up unemployment. We certainly won't have higher taxation. We certainly won't have a phony budget that makes a mistake of 11 billion amongst other things by forgetting about privatisation receipts.
Then it was off the stage and onto the television studios.
Right, that's it, lads.
The remark was addressed to cameraman rather than cabinet, but soon afterwards the two leaders were together on ITN's lunchtime news.
The penalty of Labour taxes policies is on people on relatively modest medium incomes. It's not the silk top-hatted rich. It's the headmaster of the comprehensive school. It's the warrant officer in the army. It's the general practitioner.
We don't think there's any great advantage in raising tax for the sake of raising tax. The only reason that we've had to propose additional tax revenues from people on the higher incomes is that we want to fund the changes and improved investment we want to make in the National Health Service and in education.
Each of the parties has a manifesto. Are they all the same or quite different?
Well, they're not quite as different as they would have been 5 or 10 years ago, because both the Conservatives and Labour have come more towards the centre. But they did have rather different messages. The main thing for the Conservatives was to show that after 13 years in power, they still had plenty of ideas, so it was a very detailed manifesto. And it was also trying to put across John Major and his personal vision, which is focused on the idea of a citizens' charter, which would improve the quality of public services.
You said they're both different. So the Labour manifesto, in what way is that different?
Well, Labour's aim is to show that they would be able to provide a good alternative government. So they stressed what they would do to help the country get out of recession. They called their manifesto Getting Britain Working. So they emphasised manufacturing investment, skills, training, what they could do to get Britain growing, and then use that money to increase public services. The Liberal Democrat one is, if you like, the glossiest of the manifestos. The Liberal Democrats want to show that they're different, and they emphasised ideas like fair votes, education, the environment, in an attempt to try and show that they were different from the other parties and so worth voting for.
If taxation was the main issue where the Conservatives hoped to gain over Labour, Labour hoped that it would pull ahead over the National Health Service. It launched the second half of its campaign with an election broadcast dealing with that issue. But at first, the attention of the media focused not so much on the message of Labour's broadcast, but the personalities behind it. Using actors, the broadcast told the story of two little girls with ear ailments. One little girl's parents could afford to pay for private treatment, and she was operated on very quickly. The other little girl had to depend on NHS treatment, and she waited months for the same operation. The Labour Party claimed that, although it was based on true stories people had sent them, it was not meant to be the story of any individual families. But two newspapers, The Independent and the Daily Express, claimed to have identified the family behind the little girl who was dependent on the NHS. News at 10 covered the subsequent furore on March the 25th.
This is the real Jennifer Bennett, and this, the fictitious Jennifer, subject to that emotive party political broadcast which the Conservative Party says is a lie. The real Jennifer did indeed have to wait for an ear operation, and her real father did indeed write to the Labour Party in protest. But the truth of the other allegations in this broadcast is the subject of the most extraordinary debate, which begins with the parents themselves.
It really doesn't represent what happened or anything about our child.
I mean,
It is a complete fiction.
Bear in mind, they didn't have the full facts. They didn't have all the information to write that script from my letter. They wrote a script, and when I saw the script, I was very happy that they go ahead with it, because I could see no connection between that script and Jennifer.
So why do the parents think their child had to wait for a year?
There was a bureaucratic mix-up, that is absolutely true.
But there was also a shortage at a certain point in time of the manpower necessary to make the best use of the facilities at Kent and Canterbury Hospital.
But this has now been rectified.
A difference in emphasis from parents who do support different parties. And a letter to the parents and the surgeon involved confirms that for some children, lack of funds has meant a year-long wait. That surgeon tonight admitted that Jennifer had been on the wrong list and so had had to wait an extra 2 months. While the Conservative Party sought to convert their attack on this broadcast into an attack on Neil Kinnock himself, a target they believe is a weak spot of Labour.
It raises the whole question of Mr. Kinnock's fitness to govern. He chose to be the star in this sleazy broadcast. He chose to be the star. Did he ask whether the facts were correct? Did he ask whether the doctor had been spoken to? It's perfectly plain that Mr. Kinnock will read out anything, will do or say anything in order to get into office. I must say that if he's like this in opposition, heaven prevent him ever becoming Prime Minister.
What he's tried to do is to use this party election broadcast to launch a bitter, dishonest, personal attack on Neil Kinnock. It is contemptible that he should do so. That is to deflect people's attention from the reality of everyday life for many of our fellow citizens in the health service.
Labour pointed to the letter from the surgeon which confirmed that waiting lists had gone up because of lack of money, and they say they've received many telephone calls since the broadcast outlining similar cases. 5-year-old Luke Hagan was recovering tonight from the same operation performed on Jennifer, the insertion of a grommet to relieve ear infection. It's the most common operation performed at the Royal National Throat, Nose and Ear Hospital in London.
Well, a year ago, you'd have had to wait about a year on the country as a whole. In this hospital, you've been waiting about 6 months. Now we're down to a couple of weeks, and I understand the national average for grommets is about 6 months.
Tonight, another little girl was named by Labour in response to all that criticism. Amy Mortimer has been waiting for 10 months for grommets to be inserted by that very same hospital in Kent which featured in Jennifer's case. The message from the doctor?
A truly adenoidal child. She's had more antibiotics and hot dinners. I said, what can we do? And as an aside, he said, have you got a rich aunt stashed away anywhere?
What did you take that to mean?
Well, I took it to mean, can you afford to go privately? Which we can't, because my husband is out of work at the moment, and we just can't do it.
While any such cases exist, health is likely to remain the issue which the polls say is the critical one.
I was surprised to see there was some furore over a little girl. What was all that about?
Well, for Labour, it's very important to push the health issue. So they took a technique that's been used in America and portrayed a real situation using actors. The trouble was, when the details of the situation came out, the attention was deflected onto that particular case and arguments about whether it really showed what Labour claimed. And also, there were accusations that Labour were exploiting the plight of this poor little girl.
So that means now, perhaps, that Labour will drop the health issue?
Well, they did have another party political broadcast similar to the one they showed, which they decided not to go ahead with. So they obviously decided that there'd been too much publicity around the broadcast and not enough around the issues. But they certainly haven't dropped the health issue, because that could well be the key to them to winning the election.
Right, health is important to Labour. What about the other parties? What's important to them?
Well,
similar issues?
Well, health is important to all the parties. What the Conservatives have done recently is introduce major reforms into the health service. They say this will make the health service more efficient and also more attentive to patients' needs. But Labour and the Liberal Democrats aren't too happy with the particular reforms, and they also think that there's been a problem with the health service not being given enough money. So there's a lot of controversy about whether the reforms are working and whether the government have actually given enough money in the past to the health service.
What all the politicians keep their eyes on throughout the campaign are the opinion polls, which suggest how people intend to vote and what issues affect their intentions. The polls can fluctuate wildly, some showing a 5% Tory lead one day, others a 5% Labour lead the next. In the 3 weeks leading up to election day, ITN is conducting a weekly survey of opinions and voting intentions. Here's some of Joe Andrews' report on the first of the 3 surveys.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm from Specialist Field Resources on behalf of the Harris Research Centre, and we're conducting a survey about current affairs.
Interviewers talked to 2,000 people in 100 constituencies to find out how the country is intending to vote and how people are making up their minds during the campaign. The poll, the first of 3 for ITN, was carried out in the last 2 days, and the results phoned to Harris's headquarters this afternoon. Because ITN is the only organisation that interviewed voters as they left polling stations in 1987, we can compare that with today's results and see how people have changed their minds over 5 years. In 1987, 43% backed the Tories, 32% Labour and 23% the Alliance. Tonight's poll suggests 38% now support the Conservatives, 42% Labour and 16% the Liberal Democrats. The figures suggest there's been a swing to Labour's red rose in all groups of voters, but the poll indicates the biggest change from Conservative to Labour is among skilled manual workers, the so-called C2s. They make up about a quarter of voters, people like plumbers, electricians, London cab drivers, most nurses, junior firemen and prison officers. 10 million voters altogether. But neither party has won or lost yet. That's underlined by the 4 million people this poll suggests will vote but haven't yet made up their minds. That's enough to give either party a solid majority. ITN's next 2 polls should point to who's winning the battle for these voters as they make their decision in the run-up to election day.
I've been watching ITN's opinion poll, and that seems to show that Labour is now moving ahead by about 6%. Is that significant?
You can't put too much reliance on just one poll, but there have been a series of polls showing Labour well ahead and also showing the Liberal Democrats doing well. So that's a big morale booster for everyone in those parties, not just the leaders, but also the people out on the streets knocking on doors and handing out leaflets. For the Tories, it's obviously a bit worrying, so they're having to look at their campaign and assess whether they're getting their message across.
The Conservatives are worried. OK, will that be all over the country? Are they having similar problems all over Britain?
Well, there are different swings in different groups of the population. Labour seem to be doing quite well with the so-called C2s, that's the skilled working class, and the Liberal Democrats seem to have gained quite a lot of votes from women, which is quite interesting. There will also be regional variations. For example, there's a very different story in Scotland, where we're facing, in a way, a different campaign, because there you also have the Scottish Nationalist Party, and the main issue is really what's going to happen to Scotland, whether it'll be independent, stay as we are, or maybe have a elected assembly, as the Liberal Democrats and Labour suggest.
We hope we've managed to give you a better understanding of the news and some of the issues that will shape your decision on how to vote in just 5 days' time. Paul Johnston has also written an article about the general election for the Sign-On supplement in the April edition of the British Deaf News. If you don't already receive a copy, we'll tell you how to get one at the end of the programme. In this programme, we've relied on reports from ITN's News at 10. But we can also obtain material from News at 5:40 on ITV, or from Channel 4 News at 7 p.m, or any other ITN news programme. If you'd like to request any particular story repeated with a sign language interpreter, you can either write to us, send a video letter, or fill in the box on page 3 of the supplement, where you'll also find our address.
Let us know too if there's anything about the background to the news that's puzzling you. and we'll try and shed some light on it. Newswatch will be back again on Saturday, May the 2nd, when Tessa, Paul and I will be looking back at April and the result of the general election.
Next week, Rachel Bastica will be here to present Sign On, Deaf World, with a programme from the United States Deaf Mosaic series. Join us then.